Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on university campuses evolving to a changing world. I'm Peter Murray, Curator-in-Chief at New London Architecture, and this programme is part of our Education and Health series. Now, we've been running virtual events for a year now, like many people, and hopefully it won't be long before we can move to more hybrid and then to physical events. But we'll be doing that very differently in the next year or so in response to some of the critical urban issues generated by the pandemic. We've left our permanent base in Store Street, and we will instead be much more flexible, much more mobile. We'll be occupying empty shops, activating public spaces, in inner London and outer London. We'll be focusing on key post-COVID issues around office occupancy, high streets, health, well-being, and ideas around 15-minute cities. And it's a very exciting shift for us, facilitated by what we've learned from our virtual existence and shaped specifically to respond to the urban crisis we currently face, but founded on our long-term mission to bring people together to shape a better city. And what bits of city better for us to study than our university developments, which have some of the best placemaking and buildings in the capital. So this webinar provides an update on the key trends and challenges at university sites across London. We'll be looking at new campus developments, adding value to local areas as well as to London's global brand. We'll hear about their future ambitions, the facilities on offer, and how they'll attract and engage international students as well as businesses and cultural institutions. But before we start, I'd just like to remind you that there will be a chance to ask our speakers some questions at the end. So please do post your questions using the Q&A button on your screen, and I will put them to our speakers. So first, I'd like to start by inviting Julian Robinson, who is Director of Estates at London School of Economics, and he's going to be providing an update on his very busy an excellent development program. So over to you, Julian.
Good morning, thanks Peter. It's been a few years since I last spoke at an LA event, so there's a fair bit to update you on. Next slide, please. So firstly, this is me. I think most of this is in the speaker's biography, so I won't repeat it. The one thing I would, however, say is that when I arrived at the LSE, I was shocked by the poor quality of the estate, and that was compared to Queen Mary, where I was project director in charge of their capital development programme. The LSE had really poor quality buildings and had a huge legacy of backlog maintenance, and that was due to years of underinvestment. A former director of the LSE, that's the same as a sort of a vice chancellor, described it as an academic slum, but I thought it was really just plain shabby rather than shabby chic. However, the next 15 years saw a concerted effort to turn that position round, and more of which sort of later in this presentation. From the LSE's perspective, we are actually quite a small institution. So UCL up the road, our big neighbours in Bloomsbury, are very much the largest university in the country, whereas LSE is one of the smallest. We are a niche social sciences institution, but very much in the Premier League when it comes to academic ratings. We're first in Europe for social sciences and second in the world. That's according to the QS rankings. Our total income in 1920 was 421 million. Our student numbers around about 12,600. And we had a gross floor area of 135,000 square meters with an estimated capital value of 1.4 billion. When we do our next valuation, it'll be interesting to see what that figure becomes. Next slide, please. Now, The graphs here show how LSE benchmarks against its peers in the Russell Group and London. So you will see that the London institutions are in green and LSE is in red. You'll see that we have the smallest estate, but the highest estate's costs. And these two are clearly connected. We have less square meters to spread out our fixed costs over. Plus, we have a very intensely used asset. We have the second largest summer school in the world and the largest public events program in Europe. So our estate really does get a hammering all the way through the year and right the way through into the evenings. Our utilization, our space utilization is one of the best in the sector. And that's, as I say, because we have to use it so effectively and efficiently because it's so expensive. I think what I would say, and you can see from these tables, is that the LSE is actually no slouch when it comes to capital development. And I think certainly holds its own against its bigger peers. The relative size of our capital programme is a result of an ambitious estate strategy. Next slide. And so here it is. I was asked to prepare this in 2010, so it's actually due for renewal, but was put on hold due to the COVID pandemic. However, the two main tenets of the strategy have served us very well. And I think you'll see from today, we've demonstrably delivered on these. We now have a collection of world-class buildings designed by some of the best architects in the world. We've got 4 RIBA gold medalists and 2 Pritzker Prize winners amongst their number. And I would say that 3 of those RIBA gold medalists were awarded their medals after they worked for us. So it wasn't that we were sort of jumping on an established bandwagon. We picked them before they became famous. The other part of this strategy is the public realm and the space around and between these buildings. And we have worked closely with Westminster City Council to create a distinctive university quarter. And I specifically call it a quarter and not a campus, because we're very much of the city. All of the streets that bisect the LSE are public streets. And in fact, we've created a new public realm around the school, which is fully accessible. Next slide, please. In common with most other universities, we have a 10-year strategy which guides everything we do academically, financially, and culturally. When I get round to it later this year to produce the new estate strategy, this will be guided by the core principles in this 2030 strategy. From an estates perspective, I think the sort of halcyon days of massive and continuous investment in new buildings will be over. At LSE, we probably have one more major academic building planned and one more major new student residences. Apart from that, the focus will be very much on repurposing and upgrading the existing buildings on the estate to make them more sustainable, adaptable, and infinitely better for the user from the user's perspective. So I think you'll find most universities will be sort of refocusing what they do, and I'd be surprised across the sector if there was going to be sort of a return to the huge capital investment programs we've had in the past. Next slide, please. Just to illustrate the investment in real estate and capital development over the last 15 years, which has topped over 0.6 billion, I present these two maps. The first is where we were in 2005 when I arrived. Next slide. And the second is where we are today. As you can see, there has been a pretty ambitious acquisition policy centred around Lincoln's Inn Fields, and a major capital programme has resulted in estate doubling its floor area. What you can see there is, as I say, all those buildings that we've purchased in red. And you can see the 4 main capital buildings on Lincoln's Inn Fields, which I think has sort of, if you like, extended the LSE's reach towards that very important green space. Next slide, please. I've highlighted our strategic aim of creating a world-class estate, and I thought you might be interested in how I think this can be achieved. Vision and ambition, and for that matter, confidence, has to be number one in my book. The next three are fairly sort of self-evident, but daring to be different is perhaps controversial. By this, I don't necessarily mean be different for different sake. But you don't have to necessarily pick a tried and tested architect, a safe pair of hands. You can challenge your established briefing requirements, and don't be afraid to try out new design solutions, products, materials, and ways of working. Investment in the other bits relates to items such as technology and AV, furniture, signage, landscaping, and something that's very important to me, public art. All of those help create that experience for the users of our universities. Next slide, please. Most of you will be familiar with this building, but I think most would agree that this Sterling Prize shortlisted building dared to be different. Hence, when we appointed O'Donnell Toomey for this, they were certainly not well-known architects in the UK. And in fact had done a very sort of a modest design and build for the Photographers Gallery in Soho, which was then novated to some other architects. So this was their first new build in the UK. And next slide, please. The Centre building by Roger Stirk Harbour and Partners was completed in the summer of 2019. And this, I would contend, absolutely nails the two tenets of the estate strategy. It's world class and creates a new heart to the campus with the inclusion of a new public square. The building, which is BREEAM outstanding, as all the upper floors are naturally ventilated, has been a massive hit with staff and students, and it's rapidly become the most popular building on campus. The building's success, I think, or the building's main success, is the 3 floors of unprogrammed social learning space. Again, that was a bit of a step into the dark. In the past, our briefs were fairly tight. They were focused on net to gross, specific space norms and topologies, whereas we sort of, I think, let off the shackles and just sort of let it formed itself for these lower floors, and all the way up through the building. And you can see that sort of red academic stair. All around that stair is social learning space for students. And even now during the pandemic, this is one of our buildings which is remains opened throughout. There are students all the way around that stair, and they move the furniture around, probably in the main, so they can sit out with amazing views over London. So as I say, getting out of those sort of straitjackets in terms of brief, I think has allowed this building to come into its own, particularly during the COVID lockdowns. Next slide, please. The creation of a new public square, and apologies, I've only got these architect's impression. I was desperately looking for slides of the actual completed piece, which is much better than this, I have to say. But this was a masterstroke by Rogers. It meant the LSE giving up almost 800 square metres of valuable land to public realm. But in return, we achieved with the excellent cooperation of Westminster City Planning Department, a taller and more striking building. So where we would have built across there, we took that and then sort of moved that to the higher part of the building and the site. And the building has recently gained a prestigious Civic Trust Award, which I was particularly pleased about, given that we put a lot of investment into the public realm and having an accessible and transparent ground plane. Next slide, please. The Marshall building by Grafton Architects is our next building that will help deliver a world-class estate. Its potential was actually recognised by the NLA after it achieved planning permission first time of asking, when NLA named it a winner in the education category of their 2000 awards. And there's the awards for you to see. At 18,200 square metres, it will be LSE's biggest building. and it will complete in September of this year. I believe this will be the high watermark of LSE's ambitious capital development programme. Next slide, please. The building really does have everything. An incredibly challenging brief on an incredibly challenging site. It's surrounded by listed buildings in a conservation area, which includes the 14th century old curiosity shop. The brief called for sports and art space, public event space, teaching space, and faculty and research accommodation. The section there shows sports and arts in the basement, arts and public events on the ground floor. The canted diagonal line is absolutely true. So there is a fall on the site, which made for an interesting design. Basically, we're on the banks of the Thames, you know, and the LSE slopes down towards the Thames, so hence that slight diagonal to the roof of the sports hall. Above that is 2 floors of state-of-the-art teaching facilities, and then lots of faculty accommodation. What I would say is this building has also got 12 roof terraces, which again will come into their own post-COVID. And on the left is a collage of progress photos showing the stunning cast in situ concrete inside the building. And as I say, I think everyone will want to come and see this. It really is quite a breathtaking building. Next slide, please. Our next project, which may be our sort of last major capital new build, is also on Lincoln's Inn Fields. It's the other side of the Royal College of Surgeons, and it's intended to be a new centre for data science and executive education. Now, this has been delayed for a year due to the financial impacts of the pandemic, but it's now been regalvanised, and I am currently looking to take the business case to LSE Council for final sign-off in September of this year. So, subject to that sign-off, there will be an international design competition announced in the autumn. Next slide, please. We still think there is a huge demand for face-to-face executive education. But in deference to both the impact of the climate change agenda and the post-pandemic agenda, it will be our most technologically advanced building, particularly in respect of IT and AV digital interfaces. So we will have an agora, which will be a meeting place for social scientists, which will be both face-to-face, but also simultaneously live across the world. So that will actually help in terms of cutting down in terms of travel and being more sustainable, but also allowing those who want to come to London as a world city and to experience the LSE, they can be there in person. It would also be the LSE's first building to be set a net zero carbon target. And I'm currently looking at options in terms of the carbon footprint of various options. There is an existing building on the site, and we are looking to see what we can keep of that in terms of structure and foundations, etc., to make sure we are as sensitive as possible to the carbon footprint. These are just artists' impressions. I would suggest that it's very likely to be probably a lot more timber in it than concrete. But as I say, that will be down to the challenge for the designers. Next slide, please. Part of the brief for this talk was how can we continue to attract international students? Well, here are my thoughts. The overseas market has always been about brand. London is blessed with some of the finest academic institutions in the world, and I am actually certain that the combination of the above factors will ensure it remains a go-to destination for international students. And I put in a couple of COVID-related items there. That is something that students from overseas are asking us. Ideally, we would love to be able to offer COVID vaccines to those students from sort of less affluent countries that come to LSE. And I know the Russell Group are in discussions with the DFE about that, because I say that would be, I think, a game changer for attracting students back into London and the UK. Next slide, please. Universities bring great value to the UK and the London economies, not just though in financial terms, but socially and culturally. And I think this will be a reoccurring theme as in terms of how we reinvent London. I'm sure other parts of NLA are looking at what's going to happen to the real estate market, particularly with offices. And I think the importance of sort of culture and the role of universities within that will be incredibly important going forward. In terms of, sort of our graduates, I thought some of these figures may surprise you. As you can see, we are not just a finishing school for Goldman Sachs. Our students actually work across a number of different sectors in London. The one I haven't included in there, which I probably should, I think another 3.5% actually to work in government. A number of our graduates are sort of MPs and in fairly sort of high positions in the two main, or actually the three main parties. Okay, next slide, please. Finally, I couldn't pass up this presentation without reference to the dreaded C word, I'm afraid. It has had a massive effect on how we operate, on our balance sheet and on our liquidity. And I do think its legacy will be permanent in many respects. And I think it would also impact on the design of future university buildings and facilities. And so these are my sort of starters for 10 as I see COVID impacting on future design. We may want to come back to those later in discussion. Next slide, please. So given the subject of the talk, I thought it would be nice to end with a quote from one of the LSE's founders and one of our Nobel laureates. It is, of course, a truism, but I suppose that the big question for us is what sort of change do we want as we embark on the next phase of university development in London? Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Julian. And now our next speaker is Chris Shaw, and Chris is Director of Capital Projects at University College London. So, Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. So I'm going to take you through a whistle stop of our strategy and where we have been, where we're going. So next slide, please. So UCL is a varied university and sort of very wide, and not just in Bloomsbury as people suspect, and I'll just take you through that in a minute. But then we really our estate strategy is forming three parts. In 2014, transforming UCL strategy was agreed. We were then, pre-COVID, we actually got our new strategy approved for the next 10 years from early 2020. But obviously that's now causing us to have a refresh and a rethink. So I'll just take you where our thoughts are on that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So UCL, despite being in Bloomsbury, we do have presences in King's Cross, Stratford, Hampstead, Canary Wharf, Potters Bar, Dagenham, and we do have a little outreach up in Cromer on the north coast of Norfolk, which a number of the team have been trying to get out to as a work site visit anytime over the last 12 months to have a look at. But it just really illustrates that, whilst we have a huge presence around the Bloomsbury area and, our links with Camden are very strong, we do have interests elsewhere around the London region, picking up many other areas. Next slide, please. So really to give you a background of our estate and how we compare to LSE, we've got over 600,000 square meters of space net internal. A lot of this data, as Julian's just done, this comes from the EMR return that we've filed and that we have to file on a regular basis. But we use this to sort of explain to some of our departments and our deans how much space we've got and how we use it. and particularly briefing the new provost, Michael Spence, as he arrived in February this year, it really gives them an insight of what we've been doing as an institution and the challenges that we've got. If we look at it, 29% of our estate is listed, and we've got over 250 different property interests. It's a massive estate to manage, and it's very, very difficult. It's an aging estate. Whilst it says we've got 23% in condition A as new and 53% in sound and operational, some of these stats can be misleading, and we think we're in a far worse place than that data is stating. And it's some of the information the provost realised that we're not in a position where we can knock down, fix our properties which have a backlog maintenance issue. We're going to have to refurb them and bring them to, because we can't afford to lose the space because we have nowhere else to build, and we can't afford to expand it. So it's a real challenge. That's one of our big challenges, and the new provost is very conscious of that, and he's working that through in the new strategies. Just picking up on, we like to own our property, a bit like Julian. 46% of our properties and our occupation is freehold. 17% is on long leasehold, so 100-year plus. But only 37% of our properties are leased. And interestingly, when you break it down, it's actually a very small percentage of our annual budget. So it's a small percentage of properties, but a large percentage of our budget is within half of that 37 properties. Next slide, please. So really, to give you a bit into context, UCL is larger than the Shard, Canary Wharf Main Tower, and Westminster Abbey combined as a institution. So it's a lot of space we have to manage, control, and I think our current demand for space outstrips our available supply, both currently available and currently land banked for future development, particularly out at UCL East at the Marshgate site. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So back in 2014, the council signed off a 10-year strategy running from 2014 to 2024 with a funding element of just under £1.25 billion net, but grossed up to 1.8 billion with all our external contributions, grants, funds, etc. That we are sitting there at the end of year 6 is fully allocated. So we've got no headroom left in that, and that was identified a few years ago. And particularly when you look at the profile, that the first 5 or 6 years, the money has been spent on a wide number of projects of medium-sized, whereas the latter part of the programme, the funding is very much concentrated in 3 particular areas: at the new project at Marshgate, which Gavin's going to talk about shortly, the Paul Street West development, and the new Institute of Neurology down on the Gray's Inn Road. So there's a lot of money being spent in the back end on a very small number of projects. So it's a little bit skewed, and that's giving us a challenge. And we've had an interim fund released to us of just over 100 million to start working on projects that fit within the emerging strategy we had a couple of years ago. The flagship delivered today is the Student Centre, which is on my background, is very much award-winning and has been recognised both within the UK and internationally. And the students, it's been game-changing. Julian mentioned it on one of their buildings, that they find ways of working differently, and that building has been the centrepiece of our operations over the last 12 months. Has remained open throughout the life of that duration. In terms of our new campuses, yes, we will have a new campus at East with Paul Street West opening in 2022, which is predominantly a residential building, but does have academia at the lower levels. And then 2023, the full Marshgate redevelopment opening in full. And quickly followed by 2024, the Institute of Neurology reopening on the Gray's Inn Road. Next slide, please. So what I thought it'd just useful to break it down a little bit, just to show, because this is some of the information we are using to help people understand how we're spending money. We've had really 7 projects over 50 million, which is relatively small, but we've spent nearly £1 billion on those 7 projects. But it is skewed by Marshgate, Institute of Neurology, and Paul Street. What I see is coming forward, and we'll touch on this later, is more at the bottom end of this scale, that we'll be spending more on projects in less than £10 million going forward. Next slide, please. So what I just thought was useful to say, we've done an awful lot of work transforming our existing estate without the sexy new build stuff that some people seem to criticise us for at times. that, looking at this, we refurbished, very well, some properties on Gordon Street, on Gordon Square, our Institute of Education. A lot of this is creating cutting edge space for world leading academics, and that's very keen to our strategy going forward. But also, we've not just spent it on the big sexy stuff. In the bottom left, we've created one of Bloomsbury's first changing places WCs, and we've now got 2 of those on campus, and that's recognised by the Changing Place organisation. And we will be looking to put those into other facilities as they become available to us. We've refurbished the Bloomsbury Theatre, which is part of a big public arts exhibition, and that's worked very well. I think that's probably enough on those. Next slide, please. Currently ongoing, we've got the works out at UCL East. So the 2 right-hand images predominantly look at Marshgate. These were taken 2 or 3 weeks ago, and then the bottom left is how the progress is coming on our residential development at and Paul Street West, and then obviously the top left is the long view of what was going. Hopefully that doesn't duplicate with what Gavin's going to show you shortly. Next slide, please. Then on this slide, the 2 right-hand pictures is Pearl, which is the project down in Dagenham, which is a carbon neutral building and is due to hit practical completion this week. This is a building where we can have completely flexible research space in time to model people movements around stations, public squares. So the floor in there is completely movable and configurable. So you may have seen some of the images. There's a plane and a London tube sitting on the outside. They can be wheeled into it, so people can start analysing if you change platform configurations, openings to exits and things like that. How does that impact people flow across the space, and how we particularly. And we're now talking with government around, can we adapt this facility to look at clean air environments where we can model full scale ventilation changes to react to the response of what COVID is giving us in terms of those free air, naturally ventilated pieces. Left hand part is the Institute of Neurology. Progress is going well there. That site clearance is just about finished now, and we're moving on. So it's been a challenging 12 months for us. But we're pleased to say we've pretty much carried on as normal. The teams, with Mace and Vinci and Volker Fitzpatrick and ISG have all found ways of continuing and developing programs and working within the programs that reflect the COVID-safe environment for construction and keeping us going. Next slide, please. So where we were in 2019 is we knew our new strategy was coming. We'd spent a lot of money and we were working forward. So pre-COVID, we'd already been heavily working on a revised straight strategy. Next slide, please. That really built on our visions and our before, that we're trying to deliver a core of high quality buildings in and around Bloomsbury that's giving a very vibrant campus feel as part of it, and making those spaces agile. We got this approved in February last year and said, right, that's the estate strategy. We can now start working on the list of projects that go through to support that, which we've already had sitting in the background. Then COVID's obviously hit, so we've had to have a bit of a rethink and a refresh. All of our visions and our outcomes have remained the same, but the process and the challenge we've put ourselves under has had to be refreshed and revisited. Next slide, please. So we are currently working through a refresh of that. All those visions, next slide, please, will pick up where we're going. So where we can show our strategy is, 2024 had a 2-year strategy. We had a 10-year strategy. We're currently in a bit of a 2-year moratorium, a bit like Julian. Projects have been put on hold. Pretty much anything that was in its design phase come May last year has gone on pause. We are starting to look at unpausing some of those where they are impacted by the student bulge and how that's impacting it. We are overlaying that with the interim capital program, which we started back in 2019, has released about 100 million of additional funding to date. And we're now looking at what do we do next, and the arrow going to beyond 2030 and beyond and beyond. So some of the aspirations will probably take us to 2050 if we run it through as a series of capital programs running over the next few years. I don't plan on going through all the narrative there, but it's an evolving process to us, and really taking it right down to the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, that we envisage that by the end of this year, maybe early 21, we will have a new capital programme that reflects our new estate strategy. Now, I think it's going to be very different as a programme to what it was if I was sitting here 12 months ago saying this is what it's going to look like. We're very much going to be reflecting what the schools are telling us in terms of what they need to support the academia, the research, the students, and the staffing, that and how we reflect the impacts of COVID and bring it forward. Next slide, please. So there's a huge challenge and opportunity for us. We know we've got all of these influences sitting on both sides, pushing at us and working through it. Underpinning it all is how do we fund it? Student numbers appear to remain strong. We're currently sitting here with circa 48,000 students, on roll at the moment. Now, that's the student bulge last year caused us to probably take 3,000 more students on than we were anticipating, and that, in a way, working with them during the COVID piece in the blended teaching has actually worked very well for UCL. The students, working with the student union in how that's going to work and what the offering is going to look like has been, very well received compared to some other institutions which I think have imposed things on students rather than worked with students or what they would, they would look at. Probably the biggest challenge we've got, is around what does the new academic strategy look like, and how is the provost going to, what direction is he going to take us through over the next few years? But we've already had some very positive dialogue about what his thoughts are and what our thoughts are as a Estates Development team of how that will work. Next slide, please. So we're working through it. We anticipate student numbers are going to grow. Like Julian, we're internationally recognised. We're a global top 10 university, and people still want to come. We're still seeing high demand for places, and even with the changes to some of the funding patterns as a result of Brexit, there's some hiccups, but it's being worked through. We still want to get rid of some of our lease space because some of it is quite expensive to us, but we'll only move if the need is right. We're not just going to move out into any particular kind of accommodation. We want to find the right space in the right location that suits the user's needs of that. One of the big workings from COVID is, we identified quite quickly back in August last year that the students were going to be coming back to us when they were enrolling. They were being asked, are you planning on working from home, or do you want to come? Are you coming to London? And a huge number were coming to London, so we know we needed to find study space for them. So one of the things that happened back in August is all the central professional services teams left their offices, their offices were converted to study space, and that continues today. So we've managed to put extra study space and relieve some of the pressure that allow people to work together and collaboratively, socially distanced in places they want to. And we see that continuing. We as an estates development team have worked remotely. We have continued to deliver projects. People have gone in as required rather than has become the norm. I personally see myself being in London now 1 day a week rather than 5 days a week as it has been in the past. But that's very much a vision we're now working through. What space do we need? What can we permanently offload potentially? And what can we permanently convert to study space rather than professional service office space, and help reduce our pieces, but very much driven by school strategic operating plans and what they're doing and what their needs are for the next three years. Next slide, please. I suppose just picking up and adapting to the change of what the COVID is bringing us and evolving for the future. So next slide, please. So some of the themes that we've got, the student centre has proved a great way for flexible and varied study space. And I think we were looking at how do we get more of that type of space. I've just touched on the conversion of the central professional services using professional services offices for study space, and the blended teaching has been liked by students. A lot of people soon feel they're actually now sitting on the front row of a lecture theatre rather than 10 rows back, 20 rows back, and can't always see what's going on, and also that they can replay the lecture in their own time and study it indifferently. What we are seeing though is pressure on our space from the bulge and the social distancing is specialist spaces, labs, workshops, studios, rather than teaching spaces per se. It's flowing out to the tutorial stuff and the study locations. That's where we're seeing our pressures at the moment, and we're working as a team to look at how this is going, how we can resolve this going forward, and without taking huge amounts of additional space, which obviously is costly to us, when we need to be commercially minded and very financially savvy. Next slide, please. So our next capital program, which is something that we're asked for regularly, really it depends on what the new provost's academic strategy that will drive it. But from the dialogue we've had and what our initial thinking is, I think we are going to be doing far more interventions and investment in our existing estate. Picking up, it's going to be maintaining, adapting, and renewing, and repurposing it for different purposes, and to make it more efficient. And certainly, I think the projects are going to be more medium-sized, less than 10 million, than the previous capital plan has experienced and exposed us to. So, next slide, please. But having said all that, we've still got a couple of projects that we will be in the big scale. Our partnership with Moorfields Eye Hospital in delivery of a new eye care facility at St Pancras is very much going to be part of that next program and the focus of it. And I think we go to planning in early June on that with Camden. And then obviously UCL East phase 2. We may end up having to do a building out there. We haven't quite worked out what that looks like, who would go there, but it would give us the swing space to resolve and release some of the pressure on the Bloomsbury buildings to allow us to refurbish and renovate in a much bigger scale to allow us to bring those into the fit for the 21st century. And just bringing it full circle that we need to do both. So there's a little bit of, I think there's going to be some big, but much smaller scale. But I think there'll also be a huge amount of the medium and smaller stuff that we've done in the past. I think that's the end of my slides. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Chris. I have to say, I'm really looking forward to the Pearl building being opened. I think that's going to be really important and very timely, actually, in this current post-COVID situation. And it makes me realise how long it is since I went out to Stratford now, seeing the site there. So thank you very much. And now talking about East London. Now our next speaker is Gavin Henderson, and he's a Principal Director at Stanton Williams. And he's going to be talking about UCL East Marshgate project. Gavin.
Thank you, Peter. Excuse me, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm going to follow on from, I think, where Chris left off. And I'm going to talk about the UCL East campus, a project which is very much about campuses evolving to a changing world. The location is, I'm sure, instantly recognisable in London's Olympic Park, and the cranes that you see here mark UCL's new buildings under construction. On the right is Marshgate, which is the main new academic building, which we've been working on and which I'm going to focus on today. And on the left is Poole Street West, which provides student accommodation and further academic space. And together, these two buildings are the first phase of a much larger master plan with potentially 180,000 square meters of academic space, student accommodation, and associated facilities. So it's a whole new urban quarter. It's integrated into the park and into the wider cultural and education district. And Marshgate sits at a pivotal point in this development, and it's providing 35,000 square meters of academic space. But this is a development that's not just about providing extra space. It really is about a changing educational environment. So these are some of the words from our initial brief, very much about collaboration. We have no existing faculties that we're moving here. We're designing spaces for entirely new programs, all interdisciplinary, all collaborative. It's very much about breaking down barriers. It's about bringing people together, academics, students, local communities, industry, to solve the challenges affecting people's lives and the planet. So what does this mean for the building? Well, what we have are a series of interdisciplinary academic entities, each with new and unique programs working across different kinds of space. So there's been a real challenge to visualize what's needed for these unique programs, but also to make as much of the space as possible relatively generic, so it works also for future and evolving programs. So this is very much about flexibility and adaptability, which we've learned and heard is also important in the post-COVID world. At ground and first floor level, we also have a large area of the building termed the fluid zone. These are public-facing activities engaging the wider public in what's going on in the building. And that engagement is very important and is partly about bridging the gap between the knowledge economy represented by the university and local economies and communities in the surrounding city. And that's not just about the building. There's incredible work being done by UCL with schools and community programs in East London, and with artists working on site and with local people. And more broadly, there is a resonance between the industrial legacy and creativity of the Lower Lee Valley and the engineering type activities that are going on within this building. And that sense of robust making and engineering is something that we're drawing on in the materials and character of the building we're creating, which is what you see here and what's going up in the park at the moment. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the visual architecture. I want to return to this idea of the evolving campus, a place of sociability, collaboration, and engagement. It's all the things that we've been missing for the past 12 months, the things we know students have been missing, the things you can't put online. There may well be blended teaching, and in fact, we don't have large lecture theatres in this building. So it's not about that kind of teaching. It's about how you bring people together. And the architectural challenge is very much, we see it as very much about how you design buildings which can bring people together and support interaction. Now, these are some of our earliest sketches for the project, exploring that theme. Marshgate is a large building. There are over 2,600 people in it at any one time. And it's designed to be a large building so people benefit from that co-location. But what we're exploring is how you can find intermediate scales within that larger scale where people can interact more easily. So the sketch on the left illustrates the idea that the fluid zone, rather than being seen as a single large space, could be understood more as a series of separate buildings separated by internal streets and squares with flexible floor plates rising above. And the sketch section suggests how these urban scale spaces, and they are urban scale spaces, might rise up in a connected way through the building with a lot of overlooking of different activities, vertically connected social spaces. Next slide. So what we've developed from this and how the building is organized is a building divided into a series of what we've termed vertical neighborhoods to break down that scale. Clusters of 2 to 3 floors, each with its own double or triple height collaboration space, acting almost like village squares, if you like, for their communities on those floors. Each collaboration space is orientated to a different part of the surrounding context. So the experience of the building changes as you go up. And it's a building that's very much designed around those collected, collaborative, social working spaces. And they also become the main external features of the building, breaking through the more solid sections of the facade and relating the activities going on within the building to the wider environment that it sits within. At ground level too, there are large scale openings, which are very much about this idea of relating interior and exterior activities with large glazed walls that open up completely and allow activities such as workshop demonstrations to spill out into the surrounding landscape and also into the interior of the building. So this is very much about trying to draw the public into the activity of the university, connecting the buildings, both buildings, with the Poole Street West and Marshgate, with the arrival points to the park, attracting people, passers-by, to engage with what's going on and what's being undertaken by the university. So this is the ground floor and first floor, the fluid zone of the building, conceived very much as 4 individual buildings divided by public routes. And these are the kind of activities which are taking place there. Facilities accessible to the public-facing workshops, education spaces that can also be used by the community, and a public cafe that spills out onto the riverside. And the section gives an impression of how the building is organized above that, with these large double and triple height collaboration spaces at each neighborhood. There's circulation at ground and first floor, which is fully accessible to the public. And then there's separate academic circulation that takes you up to academic arrival at level 2, the first neighborhood, where we also have a refectory and library, and then on to the main collaboration space at level 4. These are escalators that take you up around the building quickly. It's a building designed so that you don't have to use lifts except for access reasons. And that's really about dealing with timetabling pressures, but as we now know, it makes a more resilient building for COVID. And then as you move up beyond to the floors above, there are very visible staircases which are about promoting active use of the building and opportunities for encounters with other staff and students. And there's a very clear organization to those upper floors, which again puts collaborative space and interaction at the heart, and then moves out to more private spaces, academic workspaces at the perimeter. And that's reflected in the environmental strategy for the building very clearly. The whole center of the building is naturally ventilated, as is the perimeter of the building, with cooling restricted to the high occupancy teaching spaces. So this is very much a passive fabric first approach, and sustainability and well-being very much at the heart of this campus. And of course, that natural ventilation again has a huge benefit in providing a COVID resilient environment. So what does this environment look like? Well, this is level 2, the arrival area. Lots of visible ways of moving around the building, social commons, informal working areas, and views out through the collaboration spaces. And that main space is also designed to exhibit what's going on within the building to occupants and to visitors. It's got hanging points and lighting. So I'm just going to end by showing how that space is beginning to emerge, so you get a sense of the way that these escalators and routes run through the building. And I think if you just cycle through these, you can just see next the way that the stairs and escalators connect the different levels of the building, taking you right the way up, and how the daylight drops down through the heart of the building. And then I want to end here, finally, the park, complete with its oversized swans. I focused very much on the building, but of course the outside spaces and what they bring are just as important. And again, post-COVID, I think we understand that importance for health and well-being more than ever. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gavin, and thanks for 3 great presentations. We have got a few minutes just for Q&A, but I can see that nobody's actually put any in there yet. But I would say to people that you know, those were quite I would say intense presentations, and for those presenters who don't mind that happening, we're recording this, and then those presentations will be visible on our website at some stage in the future, so you can study them a bit more at your leisure should you wish to do so. But I was very interested, I mean, perhaps Julian and Chris particularly, I could ask, there was a talk about sort of blended teaching, and there's that spectacular image, Julian, you showed of your new media building with the lecturer talking to this huge panel of, I presume, international students. Now, although students say they want to come to London, and clearly the experience of London is a massive part of the university education here, but also there are benefits about travel, as you mentioned, of people having a more hybrid learning experience. Is it going to be, particularly in terms of international students, a bit like home working, that there will be more of a percentage of external virtual teaching and a certain period in London? And if that is the case, what is the impact on the space requirements that you have or you're looking to? Or does it mean that you can actually have more students each year accepted into your courses? Julian, could I ask you that?
Yeah, I mean, our view is that it's still all about the experience, both of the LSE campus and London. So students coming here for summer school, we did a poll and 80% said they wanted to have that face-to-face experience. 20% said they would be content with doing it online. So I think that gives you a flavour of how students are looking at this. Also, with executive education, as we know, it's not just about what goes on in the lecture or the class. It's very much the networking that goes around it and wraps around that. The dinners in the evening, etc., who you're sat next to around the table, etc. And I don't think that can really be replicated digitally. Whilst I think some one-off set-piece lectures, and we have found this with our public events program, we're getting a much larger audience online for our public lectures. So I think that will continue. But when it comes to sort of tailored executive education and summer school, we think that there will still be a need for face-to-face. That Agora I showed with sort of so I'm looking at a design where we might have a sort of a semicircular Agora with another semicircle, but that's sort of projected with the other half of the audience from across the world. So you don't want to come to London for a 2-day conference all the way from, say, Australia or Japan, and also that's very sort of hungry in terms of carbon. But so I think that could work for something like that. But for the longer sort of, an intense block of a week or 10 days, decades, we think people will still come to London for that.
Chris, your thoughts similar to that?
Yeah, I think we've not seen any particular downturn in international submissions or applications. They still want to come. They still want the experience. They still want the UCL experience. And obviously a lot of our courses are also quite hands-on. The engineering pieces where you need to be in a workshop, the medical pieces, the Slade Fine Art School. It just can't be done online. And we're having to find ways to make those work. But some of the more, I suppose the social life, arts, humanities types of things can be done remotely and are being done remotely, but everyone still wants to be together. They want that camaraderie of being in a community and being as part of it, part of the university. So I think very much people, even if we do end up with remain as a blended lecture space, particularly with the social distancing or whatever that ends up looking like, we'll end up with a blend. We certainly can't cram as many people into a lecture theatre that we used to. There won't be 100 people in a 100-person theatre. I think it's, even if we get out to 1 metre or whatever, 1.5, we're still down at 30, 40, 50 people. It's not the courses are still as big as they ever have been, and we just can't deal with that. So you have to do that blended piece, I think, going forward.
Thanks very much. So just Gavin, before we finish, interested that you talked about fluid zones. Julian talked about the success of unprogrammed learning space, and also mentioned the idea of sort of long life loose fit, which obviously I think is a key issue as we look to more sustainable buildings long term. Here East is probably the most long life loose fit building you could find. UCL Student Centre has been very successful in the sort of fluid space that it had, and also Grafton's townhouse at Kingston has a lot of that sort of space too. Are we becoming more and more fluid? As Stuart Brown's book on how buildings learn featured, Building 200 at MIT as one of the most successful learning, researching spaces anywhere on the globe.
Yes, I think, it clearly has to be the way forward for all sorts of reasons. And Marshgate is very much designed around long life, loose fit. It's a very robust building, and I concentrated on the sort of more big social spaces, if you like, but there's obviously then a granularity down into more smaller, intimate spaces and areas of fit out. But that evolving transformation is necessary to respond to things like changing teaching methods, but clearly sustainability, this is what we need to be doing, is designing for the long term and allowing buildings to change and adapt to future requirements. That's very much at the heart of what we do and what this is all about, I think.
Thanks. And now just one quick last question. Mike Entwistle is asking, as social distancing hopefully becomes less of an issue, do you see an increase in formal and informal space required by students? Julian, quick response from you on that.
Yeah, so we're hoping that social distancing won't be around with the vaccination programme, particularly in the autumn. As I've already explained, we are providing much more of this unprogrammed space, but we are going to be doing lectures still online during the next academic year. Classes, seminars, face-to-face, but lectures, the large lectures online. So I think we probably have enough space to actually sort of cope with that, because as I say, the larger, everything just moves up into the larger lecture theatres. And people more socially distanced.
Thanks. Chris, any addition to that?
No, I think so. Yeah, we it's just going to continue. Yeah, we got more and more. I think part of the challenge that we've certainly gotten, I guess, Julian, is this bulge that's going through. Yeah, we know we've got 4 years or 3 or 4 years of a double first year in effect. In certain elements, and that's causing us probably more of a headache than anything else. It's finding, particularly as last year's first year haven't been able to do some of the studio work. I've now got 2 lots of first years doing studio work going forward in the come September. So they're the challenges I think we've got more. I think, yes, so the answer is yes, we're going to have more formal, and yes, we're going to end up with more informal, but we've got to adapt to how we supply it and where we supply it from. And look at long hard, look at ourselves, and do we really need to be on campus? Hence the repurposing of the professional services space that we're looking at, and we're continuing to do.
Great. Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, all 3 of you. That was a really exciting series of presentations. And Julian, I'd like to really book up a tour for the NLA into the Grafton building as soon as you can let us in. It looks absolutely fantastic, and it'll be very exciting to see that. So
there's already a long queue, Peter.
I'm sure there is, Julian, but you can. I'm sure
we'd be happy to
slip us in near the
Absolutely.
front. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you everyone for attending. There are a couple of questions coming in now, but I'm afraid we are over time. But we'll see if we can answer those after the session is finished. So thank you very much indeed.